The marble did not just hold the cold of a Roman winter. It held the smell of iron. Fresh, wet, copper iron. On January 24, AD 41, the Roman Empire did not just change its master. It ripped its old one apart, bone by muscle, wound by wound. This was not a political transition. It was an eviction executed with cold steel. Above ground, thousands of citizens cheered for acrobats under a bright Mediterranean sun. Below ground, in a tunnel choked with shadow and grease, an emperor was discovering that his flesh was exactly like the meat hanging in the markets of the Subura. 33 blades found him. They did not just want him dead. They wanted him erased. The palace on the Palatine Hill was a machine built to process fear. Under Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the boy the camps had called Caligula, the structure had expanded like a tumor over the heart of Rome. It was no longer a residence. It was a golden trap where the walls had ears and the floor mosaics had eyes. By the winter of AD 41, the air inside the Domus Tiberiana was heavy. It smelled of expensive perfumes from the east, burning cedarwood, and the sour sweat of men who did not know if they would live to see the next sunrise. To live near Caligula was to live in a state of permanent calculation. A wrong smile at a banquet was a confession of hidden joy. A silence held too long was a sign of treason. Senators, men who carried names that had conquered nations, stood behind his dining couch like common household slaves. They watched him lift the chins of their wives, inspect them like cattle, and lead them into adjoining rooms. When he returned to the table, he would describe the performance in detail. The husbands kept chewing. To stop chewing was to invite the executioner. But the fear did not start with the senators. It started with the god himself. The emperor had spent his childhood in the east, watching the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt rule by right of blood alone. They did not ask for consent. They did not pretend to be first among equals, like Augustus had. They married their sisters. They walled off their bloodline from the rest of the world. Caligula wanted that absolute certainty. He wanted to end the illusion of the Republic forever. He built a covered bridge that stretched across the Forum, straight from his bedroom to the temple of Castor and Pollux. He did not want to walk among men to speak to the gods, he wanted to step from his bed into their company. He stood between the divine statues of Rome for hours, whispering to them, asking his visitors if they thought he stood above the immortals or merely beside them. He ordered the marble heads ripped off the statues of Jupiter and Mars across Italy. In their place, he mounted his own face. It was a statement to every aristocratic house in the city: your family does not matter. Your alliances do not matter. We are a closed circuit of divinity, and the throne stays within our blood. But then, the human machine broke. In the heat of June, AD 38, the Tiber turned sluggish and the marshes bred sickness. Drusilla, his favorite sister, caught a fever. She was 22. The emperor did not leave her bedside. He sacrificed white bulls at every altar. He brought in Greek physicians from Kos and Egyptian magicians with bronze amulets. The fever did not care about his godhood. She died in his arms, and whatever thin thread had held his mind to the earth snapped with her last breath. He refused to let them bury her. He sat with the cold body for hours, speaking to it, promising her cities and islands. When the reality finally settled, he turned his grief into a weapon against his people. He declared a justicium, a total public halt. Every shop shuttered. Every court locked. It became a capital crime to laugh, to bathe, or to eat dinner with your own children. One citizen was dragged to the Gemonian stairs and strangled for selling hot water. Another died because he opened his tavern to sell a bronze lamp. To grieve too little was treason, to grieve incorrectly was maut. When he returned to the city after wandering wild through Sicily, the grief had turned into a cold, hard stone. He forced the Senate to declare her a goddess. She became Panthea, the all-goddess. Her golden image was set inside the Senate house itself, right where the politicians debated. From that day on, every official oath in Rome had to be sworn in her name. The private scar of an emperor had become the state religion of the Western world. And beneath that religion, the rage of the men who had been forced to grovel began to turn into steel. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The plot to murder a god did not begin with grand speeches about liberty. It began with the sour taste of daily humiliation. In the final months of AD 40, the palace was full of eyes, but the shadows were growing deeper. The men who decided to strike knew that ink was a death sentence. A single word written on a wax tablet could be scraped away by an enemy slave, but the lower layer would still hold the imprint. A letter intercepted on the Appian Way meant your entire household would be thrown into the pit before nightfall. So, they stopped writing. They became a tribe of whispers. At the center of this web stood Cassius Chaerea. He was not a radical philosopher, he was an old soldier, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard. His skin was marked by the cold iron of the Rhine frontier, where he had fought under Germanicus. He had walked through the Teutoburg forest 6 years after Varus lost 3 legions there, helping to bury the bones of his friends. He carried himself with the heavy, unblinking dignity of a man who had bought his survival with blood. And for that exact reason, Caligula chose him as his favorite toy. The sources say Chaerea's voice was higher than expected for a veteran of his size. The emperor noticed, and the emperor weaponized it. Every morning, the ritual of the palace required the officer of the watch to approach the imperial bedchamber and ask for the tessera, the daily watchword that would be passed to every soldier protecting the palace. Instead of standard military passwords like Mars or Victory, Caligula handed Chaerea insults. He gave him crude words for female anatomy, names of obscene fertility gods, and terms for acts of submission. Chaerea had to take those words, carry them down the marble corridors, and speak them aloud to younger officers who smirked behind their hands. When the tribune bent to offer the traditional kiss of loyalty to the emperor's hand, Caligula would extend his middle finger, moving it obscenely, watching the old soldier's eyes for any flash of heat. Chaerea kept his face flat. But inside his chest, the rage was cooling into a patient, sharp diamond. He began to look for others whose pride had been worked raw. He found Cornelius Sabinus, a younger tribune who carried a permanent limp from his service on the Danube. He found Annius Vinicius, a senator who had watched his own cousins vanish into the imperial cells and knew his own name was on the next list. He found Callistus, the emperor's personal secretary, who handled the private correspondence and knew that inside Caligula's household, the survival rate was dropping to 0. They met in places where the noise of the city could swallow their voices. They walked through the baths of Agrippa, where the constant splash of the great pools drowned out their words. They stood under the stone arches of the portico of Octavia, leaving coded messages in the folds of left-behind handkerchiefs. They used house slaves who had been born inside their own family estates, men whose mothers had nursed the senators themselves. The mathematics of their survival were brutal, and they all knew the numbers. If a single person broke, if one slave bit the tongue under the threat of the iron pliers, the punishment would not just be a quick execution. Roman law forbade the execution of a virgin, so the daughters of the conspirators would be handed to the state executioner to be violated on the stone floor of the Tullianum prison before the rope was put around their necks. The plotters knew this historical precedent. It had happened to the family of Sejanus just 10 years prior. The memory of those children screaming in the dark was the air everyone breathed in Rome. Yet, they did not pull back. The humiliation had become greater than the fear of the grave. By January, the plot had expanded to include knights, senators, and the very guards who stood outside Caligula's door. They had the blades, and they had the target. Now, they just needed the ground. They needed a place where the emperor's German bodyguard, 500 massive Batavians who spoke no Latin and cared nothing for Roman politics, could not reach him in time. They found that ground beneath the northwest slope of the Palatine Hill. The ground chosen for the execution was a cryptoporticus, a long, vaulted subterranean service passage buried deep within the foundations of the Palatine Hill. To the everyday visitor of the palace, this tunnel did not exist. It was the subterranean nervous system of the complex, built to allow slaves, litter-bearers, and supply wagons to move between the main residence of the Domus Tiberiana and the public areas without cluttering the sightlines of the aristocracy. Architecturally, the tunnel was a long, cold barrel vault. Its walls were faced in opus reticulatum brick, a distinct, diamond-shaped brickwork pattern that looked like a heavy fishing net frozen in stone. The floor was laid with thick, rectangular slabs of gray travertine quarried from the flats near Tiber. Over decades, these stones had been worn completely smooth, almost slick, by the grease of oil lamps and the constant scuff of leather sandals. Because the passage was subterranean, the air inside held the permanent, damp chill of the earth. Even in the middle of a Mediterranean summer, your breath would fog in the dark. In the depths of January, the cold was absolute. The only illumination came from iron oil brackets driven directly into the mortar lines of the masonry, burning low-grade olive oil that left long, black greasy smudges across the curved ceiling. Every few meters, small, slanted lunette windows pierced the upper curve of the vault where it met the ground level outside, throwing pale, sharp shafts of winter light onto the floor. Between these shafts lay zones of total, heavy shadow. For the conspirators, the cryptoporticus was the perfect trap. The acoustics of a barrel vault are unique, they swallow low frequencies but amplify sharp noises. More importantly, the thick concrete and brick walls deaden sound from leaking to the outside world. A crowd of 20,000 people could be cheering in the open-air wooden theater just 20 feet above, and to a man standing in the tunnel, that roar would sound like a distant, muffled heartbeat. Conversely, a scream inside the tunnel would never reach the ears of the German bodyguards posted out in the main courtyard. By the morning of January 24, AD 41, the narrow passage had been completely cleared of routine traffic. The regular household slaves had been reassigned to the upper terraces to manage the logistics of the Palatine Games. The conspirators had placed themselves strategically. Some sat in the rows of the theater close to the imperial box, watching for the signal. Others slipped into the side entrances of the cryptoporticus, their iron daggers hidden beneath the heavy wool folds of their ceremonial togas. The tension in those final hours was mechanical. The plotters had spent weeks calculating the physical boundaries of the space. The tunnel was wide enough for only 3 men to walk abreast comfortably. If the emperor entered with his usual retinue, the space would immediately compress them, separating him from his protectors. The slight downward slope of the travertine floor toward the eastern exit meant that any blood spilled would run in thin, predictable streams down the grout lines, turning the slick stone into an ice rink of organic grease. Chaerea had inspected the site twice before sunrise. He knew every iron bracket, every shadow, and every door that led into the adjoining storage rooms. He had selected a heavy military blade rather than a slim senatorial dagger, a weapon meant for cutting through muscle and bone, not just puncturing cloth. The old veteran sat in the dark of a side portal, his hands steady on the leather grip, listening to the rhythmic, distant thud of the theater above. The trap was set in stone and iron. It was now only waiting for the weight of a god. The morning of January 24 passed in a blur of bright sunlight and theatrical blood. In his imperial box, Caligula was in high spirits, his thin legs wrapped in heavy wool to keep out the January chill. He gleefully tossed Damascus plums and dried figs into the scrambling crowd, laughing as the actors on stage performed a popular mime about a notorious bandit. The play reached its climax with a massive spray of theatrical gore. Pig's blood thickened with wild honey to keep it bright under the noon sun. The audience roared. They did not notice that the senators in the rows behind the emperor were not watching the stage. Their hands were tucked deep into their togas, fingers wrapped around iron grips. By midday, the natural break for the prandium, the noon meal, arrived. The crowd began to stretch, but Caligula hesitated. He wanted to stay through the lunch hour to personally inspect a troupe of young performers who had just arrived from Asia Minor. Vinicius, sitting 2 rows back, felt the sweat dry cold on his neck. Every extra minute the emperor stayed in the open air increased the risk of a loose word or a nervous glance giving the plot away. Asprenas, maintaining the absolute calm of a senior diplomat, stepped close to the imperial box. He quietly suggested that the emperor should bathe and refresh himself before the afternoon program. Caligula yawned, stretched his arms above his head, and agreed. He stood up and exited through the rear door of the theater, stepping down the 7 stone stairs that led directly into the mouth of the cryptoporticus. The transition was instantaneous. The bright winter sun vanished, replaced by the damp, lamplit chill of the tunnel. His eyes had not yet adjusted to the gloom when he encountered the boys from Asia Minor, lined up against the opus reticulatum wall. They were trembling in their thin tunics, their instructor bowing so low his face nearly touched the smooth travertine. Caligula stopped, amused by their foreign accents, and reached out to adjust a decorative wreath on the smallest boy's head. Chaerea stepped out from the deep shadow behind him. The old tribune did not hesitate. He asked for the daily watchword one last time. Caligula, without turning his head, smirked and spat out another crude insult. Chaerea did not answer with words. He drew his military blade and shouted the ancient sacrificial command, hoc age. Do this. The heavy blade came down with the full weight of a veteran's shoulder. The steel struck between the neck and the shoulder, tearing through the heavy toga wool, opening the collarbone, and severing the thick trapezius muscle. Blood sprayed instantly across the white plaster of the wall and over the tunics of the singing boys. The children broke into terrified screams, running blindly down the corridor, their sandals slipping on the wet stone. Caligula staggered but did not fall. He turned his wide eyes toward his attacker, his hands desperately clawing at the massive gap in his shoulder. He did not lose his voice. He cried out that he was still alive. He said it twice, his voice reaching a raw, high register that no emperor was ever supposed to use. He looked frantically around for his courtiers, for his guards, for anyone. But the men who had walked into the tunnel with him had already stepped back against the masonry, their faces frozen, their arms flat against their sides. Sabinus stepped from the opposite shadow. He drove his short sword directly into the emperor's chest, the point fracturing a rib as it tore into the lungs. Caligula dropped heavily to his knees on the travertine slabs. Then, the corridor descended into total madness. Conspirators poured from the side doors. Aquila, an imperial freedman, struck repeatedly at the groin. Julius Lupus opened the side of the emperor's face with a sweeping slash that ran from the temple down to the jaw, knocking out teeth. Another blade took the chin itself. The attack was entirely uncoordinated. It was a release of years of swallowed terror and deep humiliation. They aimed at the parts of him they hated most, the tongue that had forced filth into their mouths, the hands that had pointed at their families, the eyes that had watched them grovel on the palace floors. By the time the blade stopped moving, the tunnel was perfectly silent except for the heavy, ragged breathing of 10 spattered men. The emperor lay in pieces on the floor, a heap of open meat in a pool of dark grease. The lamp oil above hissed where the stray blood had splashed onto the hot iron brackets. The travertine had drunk what it could, and the rest was running in thin, dark lines down the sloped grout toward the eastern end of the Palatine Hill. The silence that followed the final blow was heavier than the screaming. The conspirators stood in the dim, flickering light of the cryptoporticus, their arms drenched in imperial blood to the elbows. But a dead emperor was only half the equation. The mathematics of a coup are unforgiving, and the plotters knew that an unfinished dismantling was simply a delayed execution for themselves. Chaerea wiped the grease of his blade on a dry fold of his cloak. He looked down at the wreckage of Gaius, then turned his eyes to the men remaining. He noticed Julius Lupus leaning against the damp brick wall, his face the color of unwashed marble, his chest heaving. Chaerea did not give a speech about the Republic. He looked at Lupus and gave a single, flat order: Caesonia. The palace above was already transforming into a slaughterhouse. News of the first cut had spread through the service stairs like a cold draft. Slaves dropped silver trays of imported fruit, the bronze stands shattering against the geometric floor mosaics. The smell of copper from the tunnel began to rise, mixing with the spilled olive oil from broken cressets. A lyre player from the troupe of Mnester kept playing his strings in a distant hallway for a full minute before the rhythm faltered and died mid-phrase. On the upper floor of the residential wing, Milonia Caesonia sat in a small room adjacent to the nursery. The space was decorated in the classic Third Pompeian style, slender, delicate black columns painted against deep red panels, with a frieze of yellow griffins running along the ceiling line. Her hair was only half arranged for the afternoon program. Her personal Greek slave girl, Pyralis, stood behind her, holding an ivory comb imported from Africa. The door burst open. Helicon, an Egyptian freedman who had managed the emperor's private rooms, stood in the frame. He did not speak. He didn't need to. Caesonia read the gray terror on his face and understood that the world had turned over beneath their feet. She did not scream. She did not call for the palace guards. She stood up, her half-fastened hair falling over her shoulders, and walked into the nursery. The nursery walls were painted with peaceful garden scenes, hedges of green laurel, small birds frozen in flight, and soft blue skies. The Greek nurse, Helike, was holding the 2-year-old child near the high window where the pale January light fell across the wooden cradle. Caesonia took her daughter, Julia Drusilla, into her own arms and sat on the low couch. She wrapped the child in a heavy length of dark wool evening cloth. She had 3 choices left on the table. She could run 14 miles west to the harbor at Ostia and pray for a ship to Alexandria, where her husband's name was still worshipped by the local priesthoods. She could flee east to the temporary camp of Herod Agrippa, Caligula's closest childhood friend, who was currently in Rome for the games. Or she could wait for the Senate to assemble and beg for a quiet exile to a barren island. The heavy, metallic tread of military sandals on the service stairs told her she had no time for the first two options. The third option required a Senate with a capacity for mercy, and she knew the men of that chamber too well to believe in it. She chose to wait. The door was kicked off its brackets. Julius Lupus entered first, his right sleeve soaked through with the blood of the emperor. Behind him came two nameless soldiers from the Praetorian cohorts. Their sandals left damp, red prints across the painted floor tiles. Caesonia looked up from the couch. The child in her lap shifted, half asleep, her tiny fingers wrapped tightly in the wool of her mother's clothing. According to the accounts gathered later by Josephus, the empress did not beg for her life. She did not offer the gold hidden in the wall chests. She looked at Lupus and asked why they had not struck sooner, before her husband had ruined so many lives and destroyed so many families. She turned her head, baring her throat to the iron. Pyralis, the slave girl, was still standing in the corner, clutching the dropped ivory comb as if the routine of her duties could protect her from the steel. Lupus did not hesitate. He used the short sword. The blade entered beneath the jawline, cutting upward. Caesonia fell sideways onto the tile floor, her dark hair spreading around her head in a pool of fresh copper. The child fell with her, landing on the cold stone beside her mother's body. Julia Drusilla was exactly 2 years and 4 months old. What followed took less than 5 seconds. Suetonius records the event in 3 stark Latin sentences. Lupus picked the 2-year-old girl up by her ankles. He swung her small body with the full rotation of his arms, dashing her head against the plaster of the nursery wall. The painted hedge of laurels on that wall acquired a dark, heavy stain that the imperial slaves would later attempt to scrub away with vinegar and brick dust, and would fail. When the child stopped making sound, Lupus dropped her next to her mother's feet. The 3 soldiers turned and walked out of the room without speaking a word to each other. The act was not an outburst of simple bloodlust. It was a cold, calculated political necessity. The men who walked up those 2 flights of stairs understood the law of continuity. The Republic had not ended because of Julius Caesar, it had ended because the line of Caesar knew how to produce heirs. A child of Caligula's blood was not an innocent, she was a seed. If she lived, 20 years from then, a legion on the Rhine or the Danube would use her name as a battle standard. A new dynasty would rise from her body, and the god cult of her father would resurrect with it. To kill the tyranny, they had to crush the seed. By nightfall on January 24, AD 41, the theology of Caligula had been completely replaced by the cold arithmetic of survival. The conspirators had broken the god, but they could not break the system that created him. While the body of the emperor lay half-burned in a shallow, hasty grave dug by his sisters in the Horti Lamiani on the Esquiline, the balance of physical force in Rome shifted away from the politicians and back to the men with iron in their hands. In a quiet, forgotten wing of the palace, behind a heavy wool curtain dyed with murex purple from Tyre, a 50-year-old man stood on trembling legs. He limped. When he was nervous, his tongue thickened and he stuttered. When he was calm, the stutter remained. His own mother, Antonia, had spent his entire life describing him as an abortion, a man whom nature had begun but forgot to finish. He had survived the purges of Augustus, the dark suspicions of Tiberius, and the violent whims of Caligula by pretending to be too foolish to be worth a blade. His name was Tiberius Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus. He was Caligula's uncle, and the last surviving adult male of the Julio-Claudian line. A Praetorian guardsman named Gratus, wandering through the darkened corridors to scavenge silver ornaments in the chaos, noticed a pair of leather sandals protruding from beneath the heavy imperial drapery. He pulled the purple wool aside. Claudius instantly dropped to his knees on the mosaic floor, his hands raised, waiting for the cold iron to enter his throat. Gratus did not strike. He did the math. A restored republic meant the Senate would immediately disband the Praetorian Guard, returning to the ancient citizen legions of the past. It meant 0 silver for the men on the wall. But a new emperor, a vulnerable emperor who owed his life to the barracks, meant a donative. It meant 15,000 sesterces per man, paid in pure silver denarii. It was a sum larger than a senior centurion could expect to accumulate over an entire career of border warfare. Gratus called out to the other guardsmen searching the terrace. They did not ask Claudius for his consent. They lifted the weeping, terrified man onto their shoulders and carried him out of the Golden Palace, down the Palatine Hill, and across the city to the Castra Praetoria, the massive, high-walled fortified barracks that Sejanus had constructed on the Viminal Hill. Claudius wept through every street, convinced he was being carried to the executioner's block. The Senate met that same midnight inside the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. They debated by the flickering light of pitch torches under a painted wooden ceiling that Sulla had restored after the great fires of the Republic. Senators Saturninus and Trebellius Maximus gave passionate speeches demanding the restoration of liberty and the destruction of the Principate. But while they argued over terminology, Marcus Vinicius and Valerius Asiaticus were already whispering in the corners about which of them should wear the purple cloak if the monarchy survived. Chaerea sent a messenger from the Forum to the Capitoline, demanding that the Senate issue an official order to execute Claudius before the barracks could cement his position. The Senate hesitated. The Senate always hesitated. Outside the temple doors, the city watch held the steps with 4 cohorts of urban troops. But inside the Castra Praetoria on the Viminal, the guard held 9 cohorts of veteran infantry. The math was absolute. By dawn on January 25, the debate was over without a single sword being drawn in the chamber. The senators realized that liberty without iron was just a speech. They walked down from the Capitol in their formal togas, marched along the Sacred Way, and entered the Praetorian barracks to swear their holy oaths of loyalty to the limping man they had spent 20 years mocking. The cleansing of the old regime was swift and surgical. Chaerea was arrested within 48 hours on Claudius's orders, not to avenge Caligula, but to establish that the murder of an emperor was a crime that no new emperor could permit to go unpunished. The old tribune asked for a single courtesy, to be executed with the same military blade he had driven into Caligula's shoulder. The request was granted. He bared his neck on the parade ground and died without a flicker of movement in his face. Cornelius Sabinus did not wait for the soldiers to knock on his door. He fell on his own sword inside his house on the Quirinal Hill. Julius Lupus, the man who had dashed the 2-year-old child against the laurel-painted plaster, was dragged to the center of the Castra Praetoria. He wept, refusing to straighten his spine, and the executioner had to hack him apart from behind. Claudius spared the rest of the politicians. He needed the machinery of the Senate to collect the taxes that paid his soldiers. But he made no move to restore the Republic, and he left the murder of the infant Julia Drusilla entirely unrecorded in his imperial decrees. He had his own daughter, Octavia, and would soon father a son named Britannicus. He had no political interest in reminding the world that imperial children could be slaughtered with impunity. The names of Milonia Sassonia and her daughter vanished from the stones of Rome within a month. The Senate passed a partial damnatio memoriae, melting down Caligula's bronze sestertii in such quantities that a clean specimen remains a rarity today. On the few coins that survived, the faces of his 3 sisters were systematically gouged out with iron nails by ordinary Roman citizens. The great gold statue of Panthea inside the Curia Julia was pried from its marble base, its silver-gilt frame broken into portable pieces and thrown into the gray waters of the Tiber. The child who had been carried through the barracks like a battle standard became a single line in the histories of Suetonius, and a brief footnote in the records of Josephus. 2 years and 4 months of life, erased by 5 seconds against a painted plaster wall. The cycle did not break, it merely paused to clean the floor. 13 years later, in AD 54, Claudius himself would die in that same palace, his tongue black from a dish of wild mushrooms laced with poison. The woman who fed them to him was Agrippina the Younger, the sister of Caligula who had returned from her exile to place her own son, Nero, on the throne. She had remembered every corridor, every shadow, and every mistake her brother had made. And 5 years after that, in AD 59, her own son would send soldiers to her villa at Baiae to finish the arithmetic. When the blades came out, Tacitus writes, she bared her belly to the centurions and told them to strike the womb that had produced an emperor. The marble of the Palatine stayed cold, and the smell of iron remained. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.